Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final session of our Digital State Conference. We have a keynote speaker for this final session. We're very honored to have Frank Pasquale, who is law professor at Brooklyn Law School, and I think an author is audience will know well, given that his work has been very influential in recent years in charting the connection, the nexus between technology, law, and politics. Frank is an expert on law of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and machine learning, and he is the author of several journal articles and books that have explored the ways in which the connection precisely between technology, law, politics, and the state. Many of you will know his 2015 book, The Black Box Society, which was published by Harvard University Press, and which explore the secret algorithms underpin much of the services, applications, and softwares that we use on a daily basis, and that often are outside of our control precisely because they remain invisible to our understanding. More recently, in 2020, he has published a further book, The New Laws of Robotics, which explores the ways in which robotics and artificial intelligence pose threats to societies and to the welfare of citizens and workers, and the ways in which they need to be regulated so that they are not disruptive for society, but are actually in the benefit of society. Frank will speak for around half an hour, and then as in sessions we will have from the audience, so be prepared for your questions so that we can have a nice debate after Frank's presentation. I will leave the floor to you, Frank. Welcome to our conference.
Thank you so much, Paolo. It's a real honor to be here and a real pleasure to be able to present today on the book and on some of its relations to the ongoing discourse about digitalization, about the state, about post-COVID economies. And so I'll just jump right in, which is to say that I think that I want to really situate the book in a history and present of automation discourse. There's been a real historic pendulum of debate in automation discourse. And the debate sort of goes between deep concerns that robots are rapidly taking all the jobs, and economists largely observing that after those panics and concerns, that there's resilient creation of and demand for labor. And we've seen that sort of pendulum happen repeatedly in the 1930s and the 1960s. I'd even say that over from about 2009 or so to, well, can't really date it that well, but about 10 years ago or so to about 2019, I think that pendulum was accelerated because I think there was a lot of buzz about rapid automation due to AI and machine learning starting about a decade ago. But then there are just repeated disappointments. So there were debates over whether, for example, the decline in lawyers' jobs was cyclical or structural. And it appears that there's a lot more evidence for cyclicality than a structural shift, at least with respect to that. And that comes out of James Beson's work, other empirical work in the area. He even focused on paralegals, which are supposed to be some of the most routinizable jobs or routinizable jobs, and that also seemed to be pretty steady. And the other aspect of it that I think is really interesting is sort of the ongoing lack of, say, self-driving cars, that was thought to be a relatively easy thing to do, but then that turns out that it's much harder than it appears to be. And I remember making a bet with someone in 2015 of a case of champagne. We didn't specify the quality of the champagne, but that's about whether there would be 20 cities that would have a predominant share of self-driving cars by 2020. And my friend, who was more of a techno-optimist, said, absolutely, that's going to happen by 2020. That's well within our reach. And I said, I don't know about that, and it turns out that, yeah, it seems like it's well off at this point. And so this is where I feel like there is that pendulum is swinging. However, I think one thing that's really fascinating is that COVID changed a lot of the discussion, and why did that happen? Well, I think COVID and climate change have really added to the urgency of two, what I'll call leitmotifs or smaller motifs in the old debate, right? The old debate being robots are taking all the jobs versus resilient demand for labor. And I think climate change and COVID bring together questions. One, are supply chains resilient? And two, is the right work being done, right? So we're not just thinking about how do we employ everyone, we're actually thinking more about, are the jobs that that are being produced in the economy actually responsive to real human needs and to real human crises that are on the horizon or even already happening now thanks to COVID and climate change? And two, the supply chain question is fascinating. And I'm going to start with these challenges of resilience, right? So the pandemic has accelerated numerous trends toward life online and automation. There are huge pressures, and there have been huge pressures to reduce human interactions in the service industries, in logistics, in manufacturing. And one could even say that lockdowns of indefinite duration have made the case for robotics better than any business expert could, right? If we look at, and in some cases that I'm familiar with, there's been some really tragic dimensions of this in terms of meatpacking plants in the American Midwest being forced to stay open, and in part because of government invocation of the Defense Production Act, of all things, to keep the meat supply going, and many people getting COVID, because getting sick and dying on the assembly line, right? And we even had an accusation in one lawsuit that's come out of these situations of managers at the plant betting on how many people in the plant would get COVID. So that was obviously, if that happened, that was obvious mismanagement, and it's terrifying. But it's even though without that type of wanton cruelty, there's the problem of deep worry about people in warehouses, on the farm, in meatpacking plants, catching a deadly virus at work. And robotization of those roles appears all the more compelling given the new forms of danger that are now becoming clear. Of course, these jobs were always very difficult, demanding, and dangerous, but health-wise, but now that the problem appears to be even more dramatic. And, if paired with some plausible promise of basic income provision and future jobs, then trying to robotize those jobs seems like a very high level demand, or very important demand for society. To get to the other side of resilience, a worse virus could decimate even essential services and supply chains, threatening social breakdown, right? I mean, there are some people in the sort of pandemic discourse who say that COVID was horrific, but you could imagine a form of virus evolving that might have IFR, infection fatality rate, that was 5 or 10 or 20 times higher. And if that sort of virus were to develop, then people aren't going to be doing their jobs, right? People just aren't going to go into work. I actually remember I gave a talk, or I was attending actually a conference in 2006 at the University of Maryland, where I used to work, that was on the avian flu. And they had a panel of healthcare workers talking about avian influenza at the time. And they said, well, what is your contingency plan if people are not coming into work? And one of the workers said, well, I'm not coming in either. And it really is rather heroic when you think about the way in which so many frontline healthcare personnel went to work without proper PPE, without proper personal protective equipment. It's remarkable. It's a remarkable testament to humanitarianism, to a sense of professional duty and honor and obligation. And I still think we have not, as societies, many societies have not adequately, recognized many of these sacrifices. And and I think that we can't just assume that those who are running critical infrastructure are going to go into work when there are even worse threats than the current COVID threat. And I also want to note, though, that if we do more remote work, more remote opportunities for work, or more automation to prepare for and to harden essential services against that possibility, it's not as if that's just a one-shot deal. Then that also creates other vulnerabilities like cybersecurity. So there's this sort of really interesting dynamic where we may try to harden infrastructure against a pandemic by making it more remote and more automated. But then to the extent we do that, then we open it up to cybersecurity vulnerabilities, because then the things can be hacked remotely, et cetera, as we're seeing now with the colonial pipeline in the US causing all sorts of strange knock-on effects. So these are some of the challenges of resilience that come out of the pandemic and that come out of just long-term considerations about supply chains and about resilience. The thing I want to add to the debate here, and just to frame the rest of the talk, is to say that I think that one of the things that's going to be really critical here is to recognize what is the labor that we really need to and want to invest in long term, rather than mechanically mimic and extract from. Right? I think the real automation question that I think arises is there are going to be situations where we view, or where relevant policymakers view, certain forms of labor as being optimally performed by machines eventually, and where there is not that much social objection to an ongoing process of watching the current workers trying to program into robotics what they are doing and replacing them with machines. Now, I'm not saying that that the terms of this are being done at all in a fair or just way. And there are many ways in which, for example, the longshoremen in the U.S. negotiated very good deals, or negotiated better deals than most workers subject to automation, with respect to the adoption of machinery and development of machineries that gradually took on their role at the ports. And so that's going to be an ongoing subject of negotiation. But I think it'd be hard to find someone that would say, for example, that a job in logistics, manufacturing, mining, agriculture, et cetera, that all of those jobs need to be protected from automation. I think that rather they're going to be gradually automated, or many of them are. However, there's also going to be ongoing social roles where we want to invest in the people performing them, particularly those who are helping to identify what data is necessary for good automation, whether automation is going well or poorly or not, and mediating between the people who are subject to technology and those who are providing it, right? So just as we have with physicians, we have physicians standing between patients and a lot of prescription drugs, because it's quite dangerous if I just decide on a lark to take, say, amiodarone, sort of a powerful heart-regulating drug or something like that, right? I should have to talk to a doctor before doing that. I'd say similarly in many professional fields and many other fields that are not yet professionalized, but that ought to be, there's going to be an ongoing role for a person to stand between consumers and technology, and to guide them through them, and to monitor how well they're working and not. And so the story of robotics and AI is not simply one of inexorable technological advance. The job of policymakers is to decide and reconcile how we're going to decide on the type of labor that's going to be invested in long term, and that which is going to ultimately be automated and done mechanically. Now, to describe this as a political economy of automation, and to think about the political economy of automation post-COVID, what I want to do is just introduce a few ideas about the rivalry between universal basic income and a jobs guarantee, and how my book sort of intervenes on that, and how the post-COVID environment, I think, changes the debate, but does not utterly change the debate. It changes the debate, but it doesn't change it utterly. So to begin with, one book that, as I was working on my work in political economy of automation, I reviewed was Peter Frase's Four Futures. And I think that in Peter Frase's Four Futures, he develops a really interesting typology of how the broad social conditions will affect automation. And this is something I did as well in 2015 with respect to the legal profession. I did a piece called Four Futures of Automation that talked about how likely the legal profession was to be automated, given certain trends toward either complexity or simplification of law, and certain trends toward inequality or equality. The way that Frase does it is to sort of talk about equality and hierarchy, and abundance and scarcity. And he says, if we are going into a future where there's equality and things are abundant, that is a perfect condition for communism, right? That everyone would be able to enjoy the fruits of labor, but be it of mechanized production, and relatively equally, and that would be a utopia. The dystopia that Frey's presents is a world of increasing scarcity and hierarchy. And that is a possibility that he deems, working, I believe, from off of a category developed by E.P. Thompson, exterminism. Okay, he says that if we have increasing scarcity and a high level of hierarchy in society, part of what's going to be happening is that those at the top are going to decide areas to sacrifice and peoples to sacrifice, right? And that is also, I think, behind some of the eco-fascist responses to climate change. You sort of see an ongoing effort to say, harden the boundaries of the nation state and to avoid any sense of responsibility or permeability to climate refugees. Now, between those two extremes of communism and exterminism, he proposes a world of scarcity and equality as one that features socialism. And he's sort of a democratic socialist orientation there to sort of dealing with an ongoing scarcity, but also trying to make sure that we have reasonable levels of equality with respect to income and wealth. And then finally, I think, and then the final category, which I think is closest to what Frey would say is our current situation, is, say, abundance and hierarchy, which would be rentism. And so there's sort of a rent, there's a lot of things out there, but there is a hierarchical distribution of them, which is meant in part to help supplement the incomes of rentiers. And so this, I think, is a really interesting sort of broad framework on the macroeconomics of automation. And I think that my framework can work within either the sort of rentist or socialist paradigms here. I think that within in situations of both, say, equality and abundance or scarcity and hierarchy, it's harder. It becomes much harder. But I want to sort of introduce my ideas in the context of those two categories. And the first thing I want to take on is, as I take on in Chapter 7 of New Laws of Robotics, universal basic income. And I, by the way, I just got a great review today from an economist, Raffaella Chape, who sort of really does a nice job situating that chapter in the debates over universal basic income. And we might say that the future of just automation is assuring that even as more and more money accumulates to those at the top of society, that there are taxes that give some basic income to everyone, enough, say, to pay for food, rent, medical care, other necessities, and some margin of subsistence beyond that. And this is a really attractive ideal to many. You know, and I in the book I try to deal with proposals ranging from that of Philippe von Barige's in his book-length treatment of basic income, to the more popular Silicon Valley type of proposals. And in thinking about that, though, I think the distributional impact is really something that needs to be more deeply thought out. So, for example, you know, there are ways of doing a pretty small universal basic income, only taxing the wealthy or the very wealthiest, say people with net worths above $1 million or $5 million or something like that, or incomes above $200,000-300,000. But proposals that really want to have a more substantial universal basic income are premised often on a deeper tax bite for people lower down the ladder. So, for example, there was a proposal by Carl Widerquist that would ensure no household in the U.S. has less than $20,000 in income per year, and would tax income at a 50% marginal rate from a relatively low threshold, such that, you know, once you make about $50,000, then it starts the tax to you is greater than the income to you, right? And so if a universal basic income, if it's framed as something that basically every dollar that you make above 50,000 or whatever it might be is sort of like that's being taxed more to provide it, as opposed to something that sort of is coming down almost as like manna from heaven from, you know, taxes of the richest corporations, the richest persons, that's very different, right? And I think that the political debate about UBI will be quite intense, and will become more intense the closer the ultimate tax burden of it comes to the middle of the income distribution. The other thing that I was going to note, though, is, of course, we may not necessarily need to tax to do that. I also mention in the book, the modern monetary theory, right? And if we believe in some of the ideas behind modern monetary theory, that sovereign debt is not really necessary for a sovereign currency issuer, and furthermore, even if debt is issued, that the issuer never needs to default, it can just print the money necessary to pay off bondholders. That is another fiscal opening, right? So then we could sidestep some of the debates about should people making $60,000 a year be paying substantial taxes to those who are want to live on $20,000 a year and not work. And we can sidestep that and maybe have an MMT that's largely funded by or have a UBI that's largely funded by MMT and by the richest. And the hope behind MMT is that wise spending will increase the productive capacity of the economy, sparking innovation to assure more efficient use of resources and mobilizing now unemployed labor. Okay, and this I think is really critical. Is that if you want to have a future where we avoid the scarcity that leads to the exterminism or rentism in the phrase framework, you've got to have a more productive economy over time and more growth over time. And that's possible given, say, energy in a country full of solar panels will be cheaper than one without it, and better transit systems would cheapen goods by reducing transport increment of their cost to consumers, and housing insulation would reduce heating and cooling costs, etc. These are all great things that could happen via this spending. But the problem, I think, for just a pure UBI is that people may just end up spending the money bidding on better housing and then just enriching landlords, right? So this is a big concern that I try to address, is that if we just go in the direction of universal basic income as a response to joblessness caused by automation and AI, we don't know how people are going to spend it, right? And if people end up spending it on just larger houses or houses that are like reduce their commute or other things that might be deemed positional goods in the framework that I think Simon pioneered, but Robert Frank has really been sort of the key writer about positional goods, I think, in the US context, then the economy doesn't get more productive. It just ends up sort of adding to inflation. And that, I think, is quite a living debate right now. I think there are many places that are quite worried about inflation given the infusion of funds into the economy post-COVID. So that leads to another approach to dealing with joblessness in the wake of automation and AI, which would be a job guarantee. And most of the people who push MMT couple it with a job guarantee. Why do they do that? Because the idea is that the economy as a whole becomes better able to pay back, say, debt issued in order to stimulate the economy, if it's more productive and if the money involved is invested in more productive activities. And so, therefore, I think that job guarantees are going to be important in the future as ways of bringing people who are knocked out of the labor market via automation and AI back into the labor market. Then the question becomes, well, what type of jobs should a wise state invest in? What type of jobs should people be led into? And this is where I think we need to make a distinction between, say, paradigm cases for rapid automation, where that would be sort of a cruel thing to lead people into a job that's going to just be automated within 2 to 5 to 10 years, right? Versus things that are probably resistant to automation more often. And I think the paradigm cases for rapid automation are manufacturing, logistics, transport, mining, and agriculture. I will say, though, that there are, if you look at the work of Lucio Beccaro on some of the different approaches of different European political economy approaches to increase wages, to increase productivity, there are going to be ongoing investments in manufacturing in some economies with very high margins for manufacturing. But I think in general, that's going to be investment in capital as opposed to labor. I think in medicine and healthcare and a lot of the services industries, that's going to be more often a better bet. And this goes against the grain of what I'd call the disruption narrative. In US policymaking circles, there's a huge amount of emphasis on using technology to reduce the cost of services. And I've heard some of this from the OECD as well. I remember just watching some OECD events and hearing a similar sort of emphasis on using technology to cure Baumol's cost disease, the idea that services keep getting more expensive and they're part of a stagnant sector of the economy, and that the people that are making goods and products are part of a more active and advancing productive part of the economy. I think that's a really dangerous way to think, because my worry is that essentially that if we try to get more and more people in the so-called productive sectors, productive as deemed by a narrow cost disease framework, that we're just going to see self-liquidating automation. That there's going to be many spheres in which, like just trying to keep people in those what the cost disease would deem productive sectors of manufacturing, they're just going to keep getting knocked out of it. Whereas the effort to figure out what actually works in fields like medicine, journalism, in education, and also what is humane and just in fields of law enforcement, in war, in other areas of what I would call the control economy, that's going to take a lot of human effort and human reason. And that in Simon Head's thoughtful distinction, much of medicine is a matter of practice, not predetermined process. And we're also going to see enormous amounts of data coming in that humans are going to need to judge as to what is valuable, what is not, what are the most important problems to solve, how do we solve them, how do we measure how well we did, et cetera. And this view of mine, it doesn't just come out of a sense of the ongoing value of the work being done in these fields and the difficulties that automators are facing. It also comes out of my work in teaching about and researching the role of pay for performance in changing how healthcare is paid for. And we have data in, for example, pay for performance, which is called patient-reported outcomes, where patients can report on whether, say, their pain is managed well enough or not. And then hospitals get bonuses from state authorities if they have managed pain for the population well or not. But you just dig into these types of pay for performance schemes or other schemes to better measure how well outcomes are going, and you immediately see how contestable they are and how much labor they actually create. And I ran in, after I published my book, I came across some work by Leslie Wilcox, who is a very interesting theorist of the future of outsourcing and automation and labor. And he even raises the possibility of infinite work caused by increasing data streams that are letting us know better how can we teach better, how can we be better doctors, better human services professionals in a whole range of fields. I'll last say, by the way, I mean, I take on some of the issues of what I call the automated public sphere in the book. And I think that if you were to think of one field that has been rapidly automated and transformed by AI, that has knocked out literally tens of thousands of employees, that is the public sphere in news. So many of the decisions that used to be made by editors, distributed across territories in different newspapers, television stations, et cetera, about what would be the priorities for broadcasting and in news of the day, is just all being done algorithmically. But I doubt anyone would see what's being done now by Facebook, Google, and I'm not as familiar, but I think I've read critiques, WeChat, Weibo, other dominant platforms around the world. I doubt anyone would say that that is really a paradigm case of automation done well, right? And a lot of the current controversies over content moderation, over misinformation online, et cetera, I try to reframe them in my book as a labor problem. They are a problem of absentee ownership. They're a problem of too rapid automation of what was in fact a very difficult and hard area to automate, and that it would be, and that to even get the beginnings of a grip on solving some of these problems would require a massive investment and professionalization of jobs that right now are being treated as what Lily Irani calls data janitors, right? Of just like cleanup work that is not valued and that ultimately needs to be dealt with by AI. I think it can never be dealt with by AI, and that's and we need much more investment in labor there. And I can give some examples about the right to be forgotten from a European perspective as well in the Q&A if anyone's interested in how that might play out. So my bottom line, I see I'm sort of running close to the time, so I just want to summarize by saying, in the 1960s, there was an article by the sociologist Harold Wilensky that was called "Every Man a Professional?" ? And by Betteridge's law of headlines, you might be able to guess that the answer was no. The professionalization, this was an effort to say that professionalization had gone too far. And I think one of my main arguments in considering automation and AI and political economy of automation post-COVID is that we're all going to be in roles where we are dealing with increasingly difficult streams of data and information to assimilate, and that we're going to need to think further as a political economy how we affirm and value in an ongoing way that labor, and ask people to develop institutions that are, if they're in fields that don't have these institutions yet, that study what they do and study what has gone well, what has gone poorly, and how to make it better. And to me, that's exactly what a profession is. That's what the heart of the professional bargain, as the sociologist Elliot Friedson has called it. I realize there is a lot of critical sociology about the professions that I try to address in the book, but and we can talk further if anyone's critical of them. But I do think that professionalization is going to be an ongoing future for unions and labor, making the case that their work is of ongoing importance in society and is something too valuable, too important, too necessary to have distributed and democratized than to put in the hands of some massive firm that's automating. And so, thinking about three metaphors for the future of AI in the professions, we could allow those in AI and machine learning and quantitative fields to become meta experts, to essentially become the field that judges the value of all other fields, right? And anyone who's gone through the ref or had their citations up on Google Scholar or what have you, you can see what that'll look like, right? I mean, if Google were running who were promoted in academia and who not, probably would look a lot like people's Google Scholar page, and it would be presented as the perfect, optimized, quantified, objective, neutral perspective on how valuable someone's scholarship is. Of course, we don't even know if the person's being cited primarily in negative ways to say how wrong they are or to say how brilliant they are, right? So it's an easy example for academics to relate to, I think, as to how troubling that is. And if you just extrapolate that to every field, you see the weakness of making AI and machine learning experts, meta experts over everyone else. The second model that I see a lot in law right now is a melting pot. The AI and professions will merge into some third thing, a new practice. So rather than having lawyers and technicians, we'll have legal tech. Rather than have regulators and technicians, we'll have reg tech, finance and tech, fintech, right? That's a vision, but I think that vision is never going to be fully recognized, and I particularly have made arguments against that in law and finance. I published a piece last year with a couple of with a finance expert and another expert on fintech, but I think it is a very a tempting one. Where I think, though, where we ultimately need to go is to create a political economy where employment fields, professions keep their integrity, keep their autonomy, but work together with AI, machine learning, quantitative experts to find narrow ways in which these forms of automated judgment and information processing can help, but the two are ultimately distinct. And so that's where I think I land on in terms of where the future of the future of automation and AI and labor is going to go. And so my bottom line here, just to wrap up, is that to renew the political economy of automation, we need to think first about what social goals are most important. Certainly, climate change has been on the top of many of our agendas for some time. COVID also brings in pandemic resilience and healthcare goals. Those are very important, and using AI and robotics, subordinating that research field to these higher social goals is important. As we do that, we need to consider further what labor we want to replace with machines and what labor we want to make more valuable by complementing it with AI and robotics. These are not things that the quote-unquote market can decide, right? There really is no market that is free from or natural and apart from state action. State actors are going to decide how things are reimbursed, who's licensed to do which jobs, when robots can do jobs and when they cannot, et cetera. That's going to be an ongoing role for the state to play. And as it plays it, we've got to face up to these problems, and there will be these questions. Deep questions of values are implicated by them, but that's where there's just a terrific opportunity for more research to consider, where we should go in particular directions. And I can particularly, I want to say that during Q&A, I can give you some more concrete examples about things on the edge, like, for example, a robot hotel or something like that. That was a case study that I was thinking about doing for the book. I ultimately cut it out, but it's a good example of saying, is this something we want to go directly in the direction of automation, or is it something that we just want to, say there is an ongoing important human role in this field and the state should protect it. So with that, I really appreciate the opportunity to give the talk, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank, for your talk, and I'll make a pair of comments and questions, and in the meantime, we'll ask our attendees and other presenters if they want to ask further questions. I mean, this idea of AI and automation as something that should complement rather than replace workers is a key motive in your work. But I'm wondering how that speaks to the present political situation, perhaps also to changes in political discourse. As what we have seen for a long time was that, I mean, the Silicon Valley kind of and was very much working in the opposite direction, as you were, right? I mean, devaluing labor, I mean, turning people into delivery workers paid for each gig they do, and such things. Or let's think about Amazon Turk, right? I mean, people being paid whatever, $2 an hour, $3 an hour. I mean, so some ridiculously low sums of money to do translations, to do intellectual work even. So I'm wondering, whether you think, I mean, what is necessary to invert the course of this situation, in the sense that so far, in a way, what has happened is that digital technology and automation has been used precisely to eliminate the few protections workers still had. Where some of the new trends of so-called Bidenomics, right? I mean, it's more kind of protectivist approach to the domestic economy, and in particular, the caring economy may provide a fertile political environment to push some of these ideas, right? Because I mean, something that was very interesting for me to read about Bidenomics is this idea of a sort of kind of 80-20 economy, in a sense of you have a kind of 20% sector that is internationally competitive and globally interconnected, but then you have an 80% sector, namely the domestic economy, that is supposed to be more cushioned, as you were, more protected. So yeah, I mean, just to summarize my comments and questions, I mean, can we really invert the direction of travel? Automation technology seems to have been used rather to devalue labor rather than make it better. And secondly, is the present political environment more conducive to the kind of more positive application of digital technology and automation than it was the case in the past?
Terrific set of questions and background on those. And I think that, you know, and let me start with can we change the direction? Because this idea of one of the things that I find most troubling in trends in AI right now is the automation of management. So, you know, people say my algorithm is a boss, like an Uber driver saying, I can't talk to anyone, I can't appeal to anyone, I was unfairly judged by a passenger. There have been these stories about passengers sort of lying about a bad trip to avoid paying, other things like that. You know, and the Uber driver just says, all I can deal with is an app. And I think that is a real problem, right? And I think that's an area where management should be one of these fields where, sure, you can use metrics to help inform someone, but you also have to realize that, like, these metrics are incredibly crude. It's not the case that all the time big data will allow the signal to wash over the noise and to get rid of the noise. And therefore, we have to sort of deal with it. I mean, I do have this, I had this article from 2016 called Two Narratives of Platform Capitalism. And I tried to sort of sketch in that article the positive narrative about platforms like Uber and Ola and the negative warning narrative. And it just seems to me that over time, the negative one has become more dominant. There's just more evidence to support the idea that these types of platforms are causing precarity, that what has been marketed as flexibility is in fact precarity. and that there need to be strict rules on them. And I think that that's ultimately going to lead to a couple of directions of reform. One is that I hope to see legislation around the world that states that the operator of the platform can only take a certain percentage of the overall take of the platform. So we see often, once, say, a ride-sharing platform or some entity like that gets a critical mass of drivers and riders, that they gradually start taking more and more money as their share, their fee. Starts at 5, then 10, then 15, then 25, et cetera. We're seeing the same sort of rebellion against the Apple App Store, 30%. Where for a lot of apps they would take 30% of the money and have no good rationale for why you needed to have 30% as a flat fee. You could imagine, for example, them saying it costs us $10,000 to vet an app. Fine, okay, that's fine. And you could see a logic saying, well, and we need to cross-subsidize that. But there's, to my knowledge, they're not even saying something along those lines. They're just saying like, well, we're the gatekeeper and we want 30%, right? And so to me, that is going to be really important, is like getting that type of legislation in and saying to people, look, we just, and of course the old story about the platform is to say, oh, well, if you take away its revenue and it won't invest in R&D, well, where is that investment? I haven't seen it. And basically, I don't think that's the entities to occupy the commanding heights of the economy to solve the problems of like climate change, COVID, pandemics, et cetera, in the future. So that to me is really a part of it. Another part of it is going to be, I think, regulation of the platforms, just to stop things like closing and opening. Right, there's something like, even, and this may not necessarily be a platform thing, but I was reading recently about laws regarding, I'm forgetting the entity, it might have been Chipotle, this food chain in New York, that had been forcing workers or asking workers to stay and close the shop, which usually it's open until say 11 or midnight, I think, and then open at 6 a.m. the next morning. And if they live an hour away, that means they basically get 3 hours of sleep or 4 hours of sleep, if that, right? And so the rule is that they need to get at least, I think, be paid $100 to do that or something along those lines. I think it's a New York City rule, but they hadn't been doing it. And I think that those are the types of rules we need to bring them from real space into cyberspace and say, oh, okay, well, you can, have someone work on a platform for, if they choose to, or you put this up there for 12 hours a day, but then there is overtime, there are all these other things. So that I think is going to be really critical. For changing the 80-20 economy, I really love that idea. I had not heard that idea before. It reminds me of the controversy about Acemoglu and cuddly capitalism. I think it was one of the economists had sort of said that like there was a debate over, saying essentially that like most countries in the world couldn't be Nordic social democracies because they had something that that most countries didn't have or something, and that is not expandable. And I think that's not necessarily the case. It is by Acemoglu, yes, and it's called cuddly or cutthroat capitalism. I think that this what sounds more realistic is what you just brought up, is that it might be a certain part of the economy that needs to be globally competitive, that needs to, and where the economy, and also I would say a certain part of the economy where people need to like make their own things. Like, for example, make your own COVID tests or something, The US needs to have that capability, or masks. The story of the industrial policy of masks in the US is fascinating. People realized it could be a problem in the 2000s. And basically, the relevant government authorities made misstep after misstep after misstep in terms of trying to make sure that it was actually followed through on. And so that to me is a helpful way of thinking about it. But I look forward to thinking further about in the future conversation on that idea. What percentage, say, of the economy needs to be just globally competitive in that mix, and what percentage could be more protected? Yeah.
Yeah. So part of that is also to do, obviously, with the globalized character of production and trade there. In a sense that it's very hard to regulate, right, any of these platforms, unless you are the US. And if you are the US, you have a kind of vested interest in the fact that your corporations are as free as possible to do whatever they want in other countries, right? So that they supposedly also favor their country of incorporation, as it were. But also on that count, there is now what looks like a more kind of neo-protectionist many things. And this is seen in, in China's state capitalism and the way which it is influencing also responses from Western countries. What in Chinese policy-making circles is known as the dual circulation system, right? This idea that is then the model for this 80-20 economy that some people are now referring to, looking at Bidenomics. So that is obviously all a question that would need to be kind of very discussed for a very long time, and whether some protectionism is first and foremost possible or desirable or dangerous. But I think it's really a question in a sense, for example, when you're talking about the Apple Store, right? What could countries do, say the US, but say, for example, the UK or other countries, if they were to impose that on the stores? I mean, different rules apply than the one only based on the profit motive, or creating whatever stores that are more like public services, right? And that therefore are not depending on a specific company or their technology, but are open to everyone. There is all a question that I think is also very very difficult to approach, right? From both kind of like a law making perspective and from a political economy perspective. But it was more of a kind of continuation of a comment on your answer. And I mean, the other question I had was service and how it is going to be impacted by automation. Perhaps that's also a prompt for your robo hotel example that you will hear about, as that is a really interesting and fascinating development we've seen now, right? In the sense that what many people are saying is that indeed, and I think there was also what you were alluding to, Frank, is the fact that automation perhaps is more likely to destroy jobs in manufacturing, but the service sector, in particular the care sector, will, if anything, grow and grow in recent year, in coming years, as we will all grow old, and hopefully kind of like life expectancy will grow, and we'll have to deal with sickness and with dealing with this aging population. And then though. And I think in the last book by Michael Lind, there is at the end of it, there is a quite enlightening to Goethe, the German writer's a famous quote of his, where he said that in the future, he feared that humanity would become, people would become each other nurses, right? Though, interestingly, Michael Lind doesn't see that as a necessarily kind of dystopian scenario, in the sense that ultimately there is nothing more human and humane than caring for one another, than nursing one another. But I mean, to come to the question part of this, is this really the case? I mean, is it really true that services cannot be automated? And that's perhaps also the reason why self-driving cars, which look like a foregone conclusion, are not happening as fast as people were expecting. Jobs like waiting, for example, that have exploded in recent sector has exploded very much alongside the explosion, or partly in the explosion of white-collar jobs, of the cognitive class or creative class, right? People offering, preparing the coffees to give us the kind of caffeine boosts required for intensive, whatever, intellectual labor. I mean, how do you see these developing? I mean, are services inherently, in a way, shielded from automation, and is it there that really we can pursue your project, say, of automation as an augmenting of human capacities, and more generally, what kind of jobs are you seeing as, say, the jobs of the future?
Thank you. Yeah, this is really thought-provoking and really makes me want to get back into writing about all these topics. I've taken a bit of a break from them after publishing the book. I think that let me start with the robot hotel, because I think it's actually a really nice concrete example. And then I think, as we working through it, I think it helps answer some of the other questions that you're raising, because I think they are really profound challenges to the future of labor policy. So to think about the robot hotel, I mean, it was actually introduced in Japan. There was something called the Hotel Hana, and the owner of it, I think, was had a chain of hotels, and he thought this will be fun. I think that basically what the cashier does, the person at the front desk, the concierge, the bellhop, it all seems like a robot could do those things. It's repetitive. You tell people the same thing over and over, etc. So he set up robots, and he had a robot door cleaners as well at the hotel. But it just turned out that just in a number of ways things failed. They failed sometimes in simple ways. Like there was a concierge, a room robot that was supposed to answer people's questions, but it was hard. People didn't turn it off at night. They would snore, and the room robot thought the snore was talking, and it would wake people up in the middle of the night. So and so these sort of failures, like, they're going to happen, and then the question becomes, to me, like, a lot of people said, oh, this shows you shouldn't automate, or you can't automate, etc. And I don't think that's the lesson. I think the lesson is, like, well, should we invest more in that, right? Should we invest more in getting to the point where a hotel could just be totally automated, etc. And I don't, and in thinking about that problem, part of it to me is to think about, can we talk to the union of hotel workers, or unions of hotel workers? I know in New York they are very strong. They have lobbied for, I think, certain restrictions on Airbnb and other types of competition in the area. I think sometimes in good ways, sometimes in more troubling ways. But I would like to see some conversation with that group about what they see the future of, say, the hotel being. Is there a way of thinking about professionalizing cleaning? To say, like, it's not necessarily that you need to have a person doing every single physical motion that is now involved in cleaning, but how do you have a just transition towards, say, more robotized versions of that, supervision of the robots, other sorts of elements of it. So that, I think, is helpful in terms of thinking about the robot hotel, and then getting into the larger question of, I don't think, so that answers one of your questions was, are services inherently shielded from automation? So I don't think they are. I think the worry is that if you have a society that is too devoted to the past, that you end up with a situation where resources that could be going to more urgent social needs are being sunk in less urgent social needs. And I think that one example of this, also from Japan, I mean, I've only made one trip there, but on the trip, I specifically chose a more retro hotel, and they had elevator operators. And, that to me is like the example of, I mean, I really cannot make a case for an elevator operator. I mean, they were certainly nice, friendly, they got you to the right floor, etc. But it was just, to me, it just doesn't seem like that's going to, like, a society that chose in, say, 1930 or so, or 1940 or so, that would be an ongoing protected class of jobs, I think risks falling behind other societies and not devoting the full measure of its productive resources to things that are actually more valuable. And I realize that, and I would say some of that would be, climate change, care work. I'm not as concerned as Goethe about, having a society turning into a hospital ward. I think that Bruce Ackerman also brings this up, and I wonder if Goethe is the origin of Ackerman's concern in Social Justice and the Liberal State, that society would just evolve into being a massive hospital ward or something. It resonates with, like, the Fukuyama last men sort of concern, all of those sorts of concerns it resonates with. But I'm not as concerned about that. I think that it could actually be quite a good society. But I also think that, like, the society needs to be thinking about, the concerns of ongoing adaptation, and also contributing to a global economic project of lifting up, at the very least, the bottom billion. I mean, the billion or so people that are living on less than $5 a day or $10 a day, whatever it might be. It's a low number, in terms of, it's a very low number that a lot of people are living on, and that's got to be part of social justice conversations as well. So we can't, I mean, no one could, I think, endorse in good conscience sort of a welfare state for the top, say, 17% of the world, of, say, Europe, North America, Australia, Japan, etc., premised on extraction from the rest. That's not, that certainly is not something that's defensible. And so, to me, that's one more variable. And I realize that we've already gotten to a huge number of variables that are difficult to, to consider, but that's part of what makes this interesting, right? It's like when you see simple economic models that say, oh, here are the 320 job classifications that need to be automated, and the 270 that shouldn't be on the basis of some marginal productivity number. I don't trust that at all, right? I think all of the sort of messy, difficult issues that we're talking about have to be part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you refer to the lift operator, I was thinking about the fact that also in Scandinavian countries, they have a lot of lift operators. And apparently one of the policies pushed by Scandinavian social democracies was providing a lot of state manual jobs, say gardeners. I mean, because many state jobs are in a way intellectual jobs, right? Therefore, they are typically also kind of middle class jobs. But the idea in many Scandinavian countries was to employ many people, perhaps even more than the ones you actually need, in jobs that have a manual component. And the idea of that was precisely in a way to push against the Baumol effect, with its kind of downward pressure on wages in the service sector, in the sense that if you have well-paid manual workers working for the state, they will act in a way as indirect, a bit like the job guarantee ultimately, right? As it is proposed by a modern monetary theory theorist, in the sense that nobody will be able to kind of pay significantly less than that. Therefore, you setting into doing a sort of indirect or implicit minimum wage. Which otherwise, I mean, interestingly, is the Biden policy that is being most strongly resisted. So I'd like to continue the conversation on and on with you, Frank. Perhaps there'll be other occasions, but we have a question from our attendees. So I think I'll take that. It's a question from Nika. Nika says, thank you for that inspiring talk. When policymaking is ever more data-driven, at least in the UK, do you see companies such as Palantir, whose reach spans several other states, as meta experts whose platforms inform and define and even set policy?
That's a great question, in terms of thinking about what is the role in bringing in management consultants and Silicon Valley firms in order to deal with questions like that. Right, and to deal with sort of like ongoing, to deal with an ongoing need in societies to address terrorist threats or to do other things. And you could say that, yeah, the Palantir, to the extent that, say, a firm like Palantir is analyzing vast troves of information to try to identify terrorist threats, in some sense, they might be seen as the meta expert on law enforcement or anti-terrorism operations or something like that. Similarly, with respect to like on immigration, border control, those types of things, yeah, there might be an existing field of border control expertise that then meta experts come in and say, well, we can do better than they can. So I think that's a really good way of framing it, and it's a way of I have a piece actually up on SSRM that develops the meta expertise concept more, because it's something that I came out of the book. It didn't get into the book, and I think it's an important challenge, because I think that in so many areas there are folks from management consulting with quantitative skill sets that seem to assume that the ability to quantify something is a sign of a superior intellect. And that's the extent that a field lacks quantification, that it lacks, direct measurement of numerical values or statistical analysis or predictive validity and things like that, that it's not a real field. And to me, it's just, I mean, and part of what I find amazing is that, I really find myself in a role that was played by critics of AI, behaviorism, and related and cybernetics in the 60s and 70s. So all of these arguments that we're facing now that are about things like about the assumptions of the meta experts, the idea that we're going to bring in this computational system that is going to be so powerful, more powerful than the human mind, and can do so much more than like individuals could ever think of. It's so troubling to see it because it has been offered again and again and again. And in a way, it's another facet of the robots are taking all the jobs narrative, right? And it comes up again. Philip Murawski shows, I think, quite brilliantly how that plays into Hayek's theory of the market as an information processor. And in that way, shows how ideological it is. It's quite an ideological process because it's really about sort of saying that there are these experts beyond the experts who are able to judge everything. And as Will Davies has said, that's an epistemological tyranny. To say that like there's one field that can judge all the other fields is tyrannical in an epistemic way. And so that's how I would resist them, right? I would resist them on all of those levels and say that we can never sort of just assign these problems to one entity and say, solve it, so yeah, and thinking further, I've got to think more about the stuff that Palantir does, because I'm sure that I'm most aware of but I think a parallel firm was when IBM, I think, was offering to the European Union machine learning that would classify people who are coming to the EU from Syria as either potential productive refugee or potential terrorist. And I think that that to me is just something very hard to imagine any machine learning program doing that in an accurate way, but more importantly, in a legitimate way. It's just hard to see how that can be legitimate. So yeah.
All right, perhaps I'll just close with a final question. If there's no more questions, our attendees. I mean, back to one of the comments I made before, namely, I mean, what are the avenues for policymakers? And I'm thinking specifically about non-US policymakers, in a sense, I mean, or non-Chinese policymakers, in a sense, let's say, now the big actors in AI, in automation, and right, are either kind of Chinese or from the US. When it comes to regulating this, when it comes to defining how automation and AI is going to impact your workforce, your labor, because really there, one of the legacies of neoliberalism and one of the legacies of globalization and global supply chains and gargantuan multinationals is that it often appears impossible for countries that are not super states, right, to do anything. I mean, perhaps that is not the case. We saw, for example, Australia, right, in battling with Google, but say besides taxation and specific areas of legislation, such as the one that was involved in the conflict between Google and Australia. I mean, what do you think are the actual rooms? I mean, is there really a kind of realistic possibility for governments and I think especially governments of say medium-sized countries to do anything to define their technological future?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a really important question to think about, and particularly the mid-sized country question, right? Because it is, when I go to MMT, I have to acknowledge that there may only be 10 truly sovereign currency issuers in the world, right? Maybe less than that. Maybe there's and so therefore the concern for the mid-sized country is really critical. And I think that in that way, my hope is that there's an integrated education and professionalization policy that allows for those in the 80% sector or those in the sort of caring and services sector to, in an ongoing way, make the case for their importance to society as a whole, while also investing simultaneously in that other sector that is more about cheapening the basic goods that everyone needs, cheapening and making more sustainable things like mass transit or automobiles and bicycles and computers and all the rest, and so that to me is like part of the idea there. And I think that and being part of that globally competitive sector is key, because in a way that's also what allows for the social surplus to support the services economy, carrying economy overall. But I mean, that language, though, I mean, I say that, and then I almost immediately have to walk that back a bit, because it's like, I don't know to what extent is it supporting the care economy, or is the care economy supporting it? It's really about sort of developing a overarching ecology of exchange that is fairer and that is giving as many people as possible in the society a meaningful life, probably also via work sharing as well. And that's one last thing we didn't get into at all earlier, but giving people the 4-day week, I think that's being trialed in parts of Spain right now, or having a shorter work week. That's another way of getting at this, right? Of saying that there are ways of giving people a sense of purpose, meaning, and participation in the economy that don't necessarily involve the 40-hour week or what have you. And in that way, I love sort of ending on this note, because so often the solution to many of these problems is something you've got to think outside the box about, right? I mean, you get everybody on the 4-day week, you suddenly have 20% more labor for whoever happens to be unemployed at the time. And so that to me is and I know that's extreme, but it's not applicable everywhere, but it is something that is well worth considering. And so therefore, I think that's got to be, and I'm going to think more about the difference between, say, sovereign currency issuers and non-sovereign currency issuers, large versus smaller countries, because that's a great question and an important way to structure future policy interventions in the area. So thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Frank, for your keynote address. That was really interesting and a perfect way to close this conference, which hosted a lot of interesting panels and presentations. So in concluding this, I'd like to thank our attendees. I'd like to thank all the presenters and all the chairs that have organized and shared the panels. It is Aurelia, Zina Feldman, and Fotini Vricchi, who is going to be our new center director, given that this is that last conference, last event of the Center for Digital Culture that I'm organizing. And I'd like to thank all the people who have been involved in organizing this event. I'd like to thank our administrator, Laura Lux, for organizing everything and liaising with the speakers, and all the people who have worked today, George and Lund and other people taking care of the technical side of things. Thanks very much for your attention. For those who are interested, you will find the video of this conference on our YouTube channel. And we are looking forward to seeing you next year for our 9th Digital Culture Conference. Thanks very much for your participation and attention today.